It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza.
Irwin, so nice to be with you again.
Thank you. And same here. Good morning. So, the Bell Estate. Now, this is a fascinating place and a great story. They're all great stories, it seems, but maybe we should start in present day. What do you think? Just to touch on this,
work our way back. Yeah. Why not? Because it's something that, people might say, oh, I live in the Bell Estate, but they have no idea what that means.
Exactly. And I also tend to wonder if sometimes if real estate agents haven't expanded the Bell Estate territory on their own, everything. So it's sort of like Village Fringe, they used to,
right. Yes. Bell Estate Fringe.
Right. Right. I mean, like Village Fringe used to be okay. Like you lived off of Cedar Street, but outside of the village. Now Village Fringe is Abraham's Path. I mean, Village Fringe is now Springs. I mean, it's getting,
the fringe gets longer and longer and wider and wider.
They're getting longer and longer. So the current Bell Estate, and just for a little geographic perspective, it's really the section of northern Amagansett off of Old Stone Highway. We're going to call the northernmost section Barnes Hole Road, which is really the beginning of Barnes Landing, which is Springs. So anything south of Barnes Hole Road, that's actually, I believe, was Section 3. The Bell Estate was divided into 3 subdivisions, 1, 2, and 3. That was the third.
So let me get situated here, Irwin. I know where the little St. Peter's Chapel is. Is that right? So is that just outside of, isn't that near Barnes?
It's near Barnes. The St. Peter's Church is actually going to be north of Barnes Hole Road. That's for closer. That's Springs proper. So Barnes Hole Road is sort of, which comes in off of Old Stone Highway on the east. That's the northernmost section of the Bell Estate, because even when you go down Barnes Hole Road, there's some sections right off of that. Dennistoun Drive, which was Dr. Bell's first name. We'll get into that. But it's basically there and going south through Albert's Landing, Lafayette Lane, Arbor Path, etc. So depending on what you read, in its day, the Bell Estate was either, I've had 2 different numbers here from 2 good sources, anywhere from 556 to 689 acres.
Yes. Acquired over a period of time.
Correct. Yeah. So I think that's where we're going to start.
A true estate.
Yes. And yet another very good segue. Your segue talents are just... The expansion of the segueing is just extraordinary.
My middle name.
Your middle name. So yes, this was a true estate. So let's go now back to the beginning. So just so everyone has that perspective, just think Old Stone Highway, well north of the South Fork Golf Club, starting around, let's call it Arbor Path, Ashwood Court, over there north of Town Lane, going up onto towards Barnes Hole Road. But anyway, the history of this place was Dr. Dennistoun Bell. This was a 21-room Georgian style that he built. Took him a few years to build, from 1914 to 16, and it was 155 acres at that time. And it was called Broadview. Now, we know there's a Broadview Association in there and everything else, correct?
And this was like the manor house, to put it one way.
This was the manor house, exactly correct. And we have, in some of this research, we had a Leonard Corwin, who was employed on the estate literally almost his entire life, from the early 30s. And he recollects how this resembled a small city. So listen to this, Esperanza. You had to get on this property with a private road that was about a mile long. And to get to the beach, I love this.
This is the good part.
I love it. He had a funicular.
Yeah. or as a friend of mine familiar with it said, a people mover.
People mover. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. So, but could you imagine, like, you're going from this main house, you're not walking down to the beach, you're getting on.
Right, because this is on a bluff, Broadview, this main house that was built in between 1914, 1916.
Right.
Correct. And this it's on a bluff overlooking Gardiner's Bay.
That's right. And it looks out, further, you could see Lazy Point and all that. I mean, it's a great vista over there, and really a great area. And again, going back in time, in the early part of the 20th century, when he was building this, that whole neighborhood, again, maybe East Hampton Village, there were some older houses. I mean, he was the only game in town. I mean, there was not a lot of housing in this neighborhood at that time.
This was definitely the woods, wasn't it? I mean,
it was
kind of middle of nowhere. You wonder what brought him to that place. It's a wonder. I'm not expecting you to answer that question.
I really, he came from Pelham Manor, and interestingly, while he was a doctor, apparently he never really practiced medicine either. He is
not in Amagansett,
not anywhere,
not anywhere.
He really was. This guy was living.
He was a trust funder.
His family was living the life. Apparently, his father made some sort of early. Now, I may mess this word, dyspepsia remedy, whatever that is. I guess there was some sort of disease or whatever at that time, and his father made this remedy, and they just became extremely wealthy from it. But getting back to how grand this property was with the funicular, he had a garage housing the family's 2 Rolls Royces. He had a pier, and this pier has come into play often over the years, because as it started to decay, do we preserve it and whatnot? But he had a 55-foot yacht, 2 water towers for himself. He lived with his first wife there initially, Frances, 2 children, and get a load of this staff, Esperanza. How about 7 maids, 2 laundresses, 17 maintenance. It says maintenance men. We're very politically correct on our half. It's 70 maintenance people and a tutor for the children. So,
did you mention? I mean, these 2 water towers. There was also, I mean, they had their very own private firefighters. Wasn't that the case?
That is also correct. He had his own. He had a fire truck there for. Not only for spraying the grounds, I guess, just to keep things watered, keep dust down, water plantings, whatever, but also in case there was a fire, 700 chickens.
That really got me, that number, 700.
That's so.
That obviously is it's a small village, what we're talking about, this Bell estate.
This was, as Mr. Corwin decided, it was almost like a little private city,
Right.
Almost.
Well,
and he had 4 guest cottages and multiple outbuildings.
Yeah. Also. So I was speaking to a dear friend, and her mother was born on the Bell estate, and she was telling me a little bit about it. I would love to just sit down with Charlene and have a whole conversation, but her grandparents, her mother's parents, were the caretakers, and so she would have been born. She was born in one of those little, charming little houses.
Right. I would assume like the house she lived in, which was the house where this Leonard Corwin, who I'm sure these people knew, they will probably work there more or less at the same time. When did this is a great story, by the way. Now, when did they work at the property? Do you know? Was it?
So I presume, I know probably from the 30s, 40s for sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
They must have some amazing stories. Could you imagine?
Yeah. No. And my friend even said that she remembers, she thinks she even rode in that funicular.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It must have still been around in the 70s, I guess.
That was riding I once rode in a funicular, so when we were in Europe at some point, but I think that was the only time I've ever been in one. But I can't, I mean, this place was grand. We talked about on our Hamptons, the bookends of East Hampton, Southampton Village. This was almost a little bit different just by the sheer mass of the land holdings. I mean, this was just an extraordinary, the sheer size. And to that point, while it started out as 155 acres, he ultimately accumulated, and again, I have a couple of different numbers on this, but 556 acres is the one that seems to come up most, although a friend of mine who does this kind of thing professionally said it was actually upwards of 689. The only thing I could think of is maybe the difference was he at one point, and we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but it'll also help in terms of the geographic perspective. The park at Fresh Pond, which is called, which is named for him. It's the Bell Estate Park, but most of the people here call it Fresh Pond, Albert's Landing, Little Albert's, was donated by the Bells to the town, and the town ultimately in 1993 preserved these 120 acres. So that's where we are. And one last thing to touch on about how grand this place was, Esperanza. How about the dentist chair? Because the dentist came to him.
Yes. The house was equipped with a dentist chair. I get because the dentist came to you.
Right.
It wasn't because Dr. Bell, practiced on his family. No. The dentist would pay house calls. That's what it was.
That's me. I have a toothache. I wait 3 weeks for an appointment. This guy had a dentist coming to his house. But anyway, but also I will say the Bells were really respected within the community. Yeah. And from what I've read, they really donated a lot of money to the community. And again, you saw the park at Fresh Pond and other organizations as well, Southampton Hospital, some local churches and everything else. So now, I guess we have to fast forward a little bit because we're going to try to bring this into a little bit more present day. And Dr. Bell died in 1954, and his second wife, Agnes, stayed on the property from 54 until she died in 68. And
just to be clear with our dates, so he died in 1954, and just before then was when he donated the land for the park that we were talking about, Albert's Landing, correct. Fresh Pond, which was 117 acres, like you're saying. So maybe it was up to 600 plus acres that they had.
Exactly. And this was probably, thinking of all this acreage. I mean, I know, I guess most of it was on the Gardiner's Bay side of Old Stone Highway, the eastern side. But again, those streets, the subdivision signs, which are on the other side, Lafayette Lane and some of the others, I'm going to assume that's part of the Bell Estate also, maybe because that's a lot of property. It had to probably expand to both sides, but it was unclear. You ever try to navigate the Town of East Hampton website, Esperanza? It's not the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, no, it's a labyrinth.
Yeah, so it is a labyrinth, and I tried to find out, but it was just, you type in a search, and well, I don't want to go.
And you get 6,000 other things that you weren't looking for.
Correct. So it was just, I hopefully we can just take a little poetic license here. So, but anyway, so now we're getting more into present day. And this is a part of the story, I did not know. In 1969, this property was purchased from the trustees of the estate by a group called BT Properties. So now this is 1969, and whose principals were Charles Benenson. That's a name I didn't know, but I do know these two, Lawrence and Preston Tish. The Tishes, big land, property owners in New York, and maybe for sports fans, better known as the owners of the New York Giants. So,
oh, okay. News to me. I
don't think they owned it back then. I think it was owned by, we're not a sports podcast here. I think Wellington Mara owned it, but the Tishes are, I think, the managing partners now. So, but anyway, that's where that is. So at this point, the Tishes bought it, $2.4 million for this property. And this is where I guess their intent was, well, let's see if we can develop it. And now here's where some of these really cool stories come into play. I guess I should have started this with giving the cast of characters involved in a lot of this Esperanza.
Okay, now, so we've got the Tishes.
we got the Tishes, but how about this was really a great part of the story. I thought how the Shah of Iran is actually a part of the story. Now,
which at this time, by the time this starts kind of bubbling, right? Is
that exactly, we're getting it right. It's a little bit ahead of ourselves because now the Tishes had this property for a while, and they weren't really able to, I guess their plan was to really sell it to sort of like a big parcel. There were other parcels at the time that were out on the East End. There was a section, I didn't even tell you this initially, but if you recall, Bayberry land in Southampton, which was a big parcel over 300 acres off of Sabonic Road, which I think an electrical union ultimately bought. That was the kind of thing that I think they were looking to do here, but they just couldn't make it happen. But
yeah, I know about the one that you're talking about. That's another good story.
That's another good story, and I think it became. But yeah, we'll save that for another day. Yet another segue, unintended there, but there's just so much cool information about these things. But so there were efforts over the years to try to attract the buyers, and it began, in 78, there was, they had tried to market this property. The auction house, Sotheby Park Barnet, got involved. And interestingly, back then in 78, not ancient history, as this research tells me, multi-millionaires, quote unquote, because by the way, these days everyone is a millionaire in East Hampton. There's not a property under $1 million. If you own a house, we're all
exactly. That's so true.
Yeah, so we're all, but people with a taste for this kind of way of life that Dr. Bell was living was already scarce, except, and here's where the story gets pretty cool. When a New York lawyer appeared on behalf of a Swiss client who, with no conditions, was willing to pay, this is a very cool part of the story, willing to pay $8 million for this kind of seclusion offered by the mansion and its then 240 acres. So
that was in today's dollars, it says 24 million, right?
That is correct. So
if it was 240 acres,
yeah,
work it out.
right. Not inexpensive.
Not inexpensive.
Not inexpensive.
Sounds, $8 million, 240 acres. No,
right.
Inflation.
Because remember around 1980, you could really buy a beautiful house for, well, what, we won't go down there either, but it was always a lot of money, $24 million in today's money. But the person associated with the Tishes was an East Hampton builder. His name was Robert Barnes. He was with them for a while. Did you recognize that name at all, Esperanza? Robert Barnes?
Not really. I mean, Barnes, obviously is a name that circulates around here, but it didn't ring a bell to me.
Yeah, it didn't ring a bell to me either. Because I know there's like a Barnes Lane with this spelling in the northwest section of East Hampton. Don't know if there's a connection. There may be, may not be. But regardless, Mr. Barnes felt this long search was over. And here we go. And I know you have this in front of you, so you know the story. The deal fell through just before the 1980 elections. That was the election, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan. And it was also, if we recall, the height of the Iran hostage crisis. So President Carter at the time ordered an inventory of the holdings of the family of the late Shah of Iran. So according to Mr. Barnes, he was told unofficially that it was the Shah of Iran's sister who was interested in buying this. And because of the Iran hostage crisis and everything else, that deal died.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, if we just take a step back and think about it for 1 second, how different, just how history changes everything. And if there was, look, obviously, if is the biggest word in the English language. We know this, but had there not been an Iran hostage crisis, had the Shah not been overthrown and all of this, the Shah of Iran's sister would have bought this property and probably kept it as is
intact. Yeah.
240 acres. So we would not have had these massive subdivisions. The whole character of northern Amagansett would have been different. And I think about those things, and that's now. There was attempts a few years earlier to acquire this, the Springs Civic Association. I don't even know if that's, we have organizations up here in Springs. I don't know if there's an actual one term, the Springs Civic Association, but they tried to push something like this through. But now again, history being what it was in 75 when this came about, the assistant planning director was saying the county was going through all of these budget cuts. They just didn't have it in the budget. So that's sort of where
that's in the county, because they were thinking of a county acquisition.
A county
which is how things used to happen, right? I mean, there was always county involvement, state involvement, and town would just purchase things, if they could, but it wasn't because of CPF. We have to remember that, we have fortunate to have the CPF these days.
That's an excellent point, because yes, this predated CPF. And so that was before that, but we were fortunate at the time. This was during that era, maybe a little bit before. We had a Suffolk County, and again, we're diverting a little bit, but we had a Suffolk County executive, John V.N. Klein, who was very, very, I won't use the term anti-development, but really focused on maintaining the integrity of Eastern Long Island as he watched the sprawl continue moving out into Western Suffolk County, where he was from, about Smithtown. And so these kind of things were on radar to maintain farmland, open space, even back then. But
yeah, in particular in this time, I think.
For sure. And I think this is where we're going to, keep going on this, because I sent you this. How about some of these subdivision proposals that came up, Esperanza? The one for 1,390 units.
And lavish, my favorite word.
Please say
amenities.
Lavish, and
including 20 tennis courts, 10 paddle tennis courts, and a club with a 100-unit motel. There's plenty of room for it, for sure.
No question about it. And if you want to talk about, my gosh, if you want to think about this for a second, you did have all of that room, but how about the differences in what was sort of out there at the time? You had the Shah of Iran's sister, who would have kept 240 acres for herself, one person living there, probably going a few times a year maximum, to all the way to something like this, a subdivision with all of these units. That was an entirely other kind of transformation. And Tom Thorson, who was East Hampton Town's planning director through the 70s, that's a name that rang a bell to me.
Yeah,
probably you as well.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
There were a ton of different development proposals at this time. So he was all sorts of crazy stuff was going on. But by the fall of 1980, the owners of the Bell estate had discovered,
and it was still the Tisches, right?
It was still the Tisches. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So they were saying that maybe this new zoning wasn't that difficult to live with, because these 2-acre lots, and this is according to Thomas Thorson, were selling like hotcakes. And the first 2 sections were in various stages of development at that time. It was a combination of 132 lots, 45 parcels. Prices were averaging $45,000 to $50,000, and they were selling rapidly. So this is sort of where we're coming into the present day. Basically, this property was getting developed as it is, because again, to just touch on that point earlier, there weren't many people other than apparently the Shah of Iran's sister who were willing to keep this property in this kind of state. And remember, the Tisches and their partner bought this property in 69. So this was 10 plus years like this until they really started the developing. As a matter of fact, they were paying the bills, from what I've read, with income from the Bank of Tokyo, who was leasing the property as sort of an R&R center for its employees, which is
like a retreat, like a,
yes,
I see.
exactly. So that's how it was.
They had to pay all the taxes and everything else. I guess that's not sustainable after a while.
Exactly. So basically, this is going to be where we're sort of going to wrap this whole thing up. The Bell Estate, as you know it, was being developed in these 2-acre lots, and beautiful neighborhood. But there's one last final part of this story, and that was Reginald and Loida Lewis. And they bought the manor house and the 5.5 acres from the Tishes. And this was 1988 for $3.8 million.
So Broadview was on a 5-acre lot, right? And the subdivision was made that way. So Broadview remained with 5 acres, and then everything else was subdivided into basically 2-acre lots.
That is how I'm reading it correct. Exactly. Okay. And again, the big section that was given to the town, which is now
right.
You look on a map, they'll say Dennistoun Bell Park. Everyone I know calls it Alberts or Little Alberts or Fresh Pond. Yeah. We've all been there. Great little spot, by the way. Hiking trails going through there. Really beautiful. But anyway, so the Lewises, now we should touch on Reginald Lewis for a second. And this is not my words. This is what he was called. He was the, quote, first Black billionaire. He did we're also not a finance, and he did a leverage buyout, whatever that means, of Beatrice Foods back in the day. And
before that, McCall's pattern making. Right. I mean, he turned around companies. He was an attorney, very successful attorney, but turned around these companies like nobody's business.
That's apparently the case. And his wife, Loida Lewis, was
also an attorney.
Also very successful in her own right. This was a real power couple.
I was just going to say that. You took the words right out of my mouth.
Don't we finish each other's sentences?
Yes.
We say sometimes. So yes, this was a real power couple in this day, and so they bought this house, and they just loved living there, and they were the lords of this manor. They were living sort of in that style of maybe not as grand as when Dr. Bell lived, but they had this 5.5 acres. I think they had a couple of daughters also. And unfortunately, the house subsequently burned down in 91. And
which is such an irony in a way, considering that Dr. Bell had his own fire truck way back when.
I didn't even think of that, but that's a great point. Yeah. Dr. Bell, that house wouldn't have burned down necessarily with Dr. Bell with that fire truck.
Right.
But that's a very cool reference. I didn't think of that's excellent point. But yes. And of course, at the time, it was investigated. It didn't appear to be arson, but of course, there was thoughts of, was this some sort of racially charged fire? I mean, let's be honest here. This is that the world we live in today was going on back then also. But a little bit of a brouhaha did occur when Reginald Lewis, who was a big contributor and ally to then New York City Mayor David Dinkins, sent in New York arson specialists to investigate, and local feathers were ruffled dramatically.
No doubt.
Police,
well, local feathers may have been ruffled, but the Lewises did send each of the firefighters from the local fire departments Thanksgiving turkeys. I understand
that they did, which was a terrific gesture by the Lewises. And they, unfortunately, Reginald Lewis died, had brain cancer, diagnosed, I think, in 90 or 91, and died literally a month after that diagnosis. Loida Lewis is still here, lives somewhere in East Hampton Village, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I learned that.
And so she's still here, and I maintains a website about, Reginald's legacy. But
I know. And if I can just mention, I mean, she sounds like you said, a power couple, but she sounds like a powerhouse. She's a Filipino born woman, successfully passed the bar, New York State, and, was an early female attorney and has worked for immigration rights for years and years.
Yeah.
I mean, the achievements of these people, it's pretty incredible.
We're extraordinary. And again, for Reginald, both of them, both of them being, she being from the Philippines, and Reginald, African Americans doing leverage buyouts in the late 80s was not common.
Yeah.
Okay. This was a pretty special couple, and they recognized, I guess, how special this property was. And while it's tragic that the house is no longer there, in a sense, it's almost, I hate to say something like a fitting conclusion, because I don't want to, it may not be the right term, but you really did have lords of the manor from the first to the end.
Yeah, that's a good point. It is true. And I think people that were truly invested in this community as well,
both of them,
from what I read. Yeah.
Loida still to this day, does a lot of really charitable endeavors, within the town of East Hampton. So I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much for taking this Bell Estate journey with me, Esperanza, right?
Well, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. I was thinking about, one other little story. I was thinking, my friend said, because I said, it's sort of like that French expression, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. It's more things change, the more they stay the same. And thinking of these estates, she said that her grandfather would get a call from Dr. Bell, and if it was after 6, you knew somebody was out on that pier.
Yeah.
Trespassing.
Wow.
And he had to go check it out, and I said, oh, really? Nothing has changed, has it?
Not
You get calls at all hours.
For sure. And
in this world that we live.
That's a great place to go. And even Leonard Corwin, he, when he was talking about how the, townspeople have, the local people, how much they loved having this property and everything here. And Leonard Corwin, by the way, just to wrap up with, to take your point even a little further, was on that property, home and living for almost 50 years. Again, I'm sure he knew, the people you were referring to earlier, but he said, you can't keep property if you don't do anything with it. The local people don't like it, but somebody's got to pay the taxes.
Exactly.
That was
pragmatism, really, local pragmatism at its best.
That's Bonic logic right there.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
All right, Esperanza.
That was fun. Really fun. So much to think about and so much to still delve into. So I'm going to keep looking into this.
You never know. There may be a Bell Estate Part 2.
Well, why not?
Thank you, Esperanza.
Great talking to you.
Same
Bye.
here. Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.